In case this is your first time.
This meeting is being recorded.
If this is your first time, we'll share the link at the end of the session so that you can go back and look at some of the videos that we've done before now. This session is being organized by the Policy Shapers. Policy Shapers is a group of young people, who have come together to drive policy ideas and innovations. Really, it's a civic tech organization, and we're looking at, the role and participation of youth in public policy. Yes, we might be starting out from Nigeria, but the vision really is to expand beyond Nigeria, promote policy ideas, dialogue, and help to guide youth-led advocacy initiatives. So that's who the policy shapers are. And then the policy shapers really have come together to put together this policy hackathon in collaboration with quite a number of other people who are passionate, and the goal really, is to help to harness these ideas. You can see on the slide when that will be happening, from August 12th to 14th this year. There's going to be a virtual policy hackathon, and we believe that it is important to generally give the guide, share information, share skills and knowledge to, to bring out the best in the policy ideas that are going to be harvested from that virtual hackathon. So that's one of the purpose for these, series, that we're organizing prior to August 12th. Yes, please kindly go to the next slide. Yes, so we have two facilitators. So we'll be facilitating, but we have two speakers that will be taking us through the session. Mr. Adewunmi Babayemi, who is a policy analyst. He will talk more about himself. And we have Oyinkansola Odidi, who is also a policy analyst, and they will be sharing with us, what are the required skills, knowledge, so required to develop a policy document and how to push it forward. So at this moment, I'll pass it right on to our facilitators. So they are very good at what they've come to do, and they'll be giving us, coordinating the session in a very coordinated way, bouncing off ideas amongst themselves. So I'll pass it over to you first. I just want to also check, because I've seen Adewunmi Babayemi. Is Oyinkansola on the call already?
Yeah, I think she is. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. All right. So I'll pass it over to you, because at least I can see you first. So I know they say ladies first, but but let's yeah.
No worries at all. Thank you very much, Otari, and thank you very much to Policy Shapers for inviting myself and Oyinkansola to kind of deliver this study today, or this lecture. So I think, to be courteous, I'll probably invite Oyinkansola to introduce herself, so like they say in this part of the world, ladies first. So Oyin, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us about what you are currently doing and your background as well?
Okay, thank you, Babayemi. Adewunmi. They always say ladies. They say ladies before men, or so. Ladies first, but some people say after men. So we really don't know. Anyways, thank you, Policy Shapers, and thank you to everyone who has joined and to those who will be joining. My name is Oyinkansola Odidi, and I work with the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. I have a first degree in biochemistry, but that's conversation for another day. But what I currently do with the NESG is I manage the economic roundtable within the NESG that has to do with subnationals, and it's called the NESG NGF Economic Roundtable. And this is essentially a collaboration between the Nigeria Governors Forum and the NESG. And the idea behind it is to promote subnational competitiveness. So I'll stop there and hand over the mic to Adewunmi. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Oyin. So my full name is Adewunmi Babayemi, and I'm an economist by training. So I've got a master's degree in economics from the University of Bath over how many years ago? 10 years ago. And I started my career in policy, economic policy, economic regulation, market regulations in the UK Chancellor's Office, which is HM Treasury, or you can say Ministry of Finance. Subsequently, then went on to work in various roles, including policy, trade policy, to economics, to infrastructure. And currently I'm working on infrastructure, which is policy on infrastructure delivery, as well as actually how do you fund infrastructure and what are the benefits of the government and the private sector coming together to deliver infrastructure for the UK taxpayers. So that's what I currently do. You know, I'm equally here to learn, just like everyone else. So I've got 10 years of experience, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call as well. We're probably in the same age range or experience range as well. I'm currently also a bridge fellow at the NESG, like Oyin and Ebenezer, and I'm quite encouraged, in fact, very encouraged to see young people pursuing policy implementation, policy formulation, and it's something that I'm very interested in. And so, well done to you guys. I would like to say that formally. So that's me, and I think we can go to the next slide. So myself and Onyi would probably just take this in turn, and I want to make this session very interactive. You know, it's not just going to be myself and Onyi talking at you guys. I want you guys to chip in. I want you to ask questions as we go along. So I think it's probably worth going back to the session that you had last week, which is where I think they took you through kind of formulation of policy, making policy. And I think it's worth reiterating the fundamentals of making good policy. What are the factors of making good policy, whether within government or corporate organizations or think tank or NGOs? So firstly, your policy must be very clear. You know, what are the goals that you're trying to achieve? What are the objectives? To what end is the policy that you're bringing forth? You know, what are the wider impact? And you must be very open, transparent, and collect as much or as many kind of evidence to back up the reason for that policy. As part of that, you will do consultation, internal consultation within government, and then you do external consultation with industry, and you also, you know, give the general public the opportunity to impact and influence the policy. And then the policy process must be very rigorous. And I'm sure the last week's session I've taken you through the process for policy design. The policy design must be very rigorous. There must be a standard framework. You know, there must be a framework, domestic and international framework that you're following in developing that policy. And the policy must also be very responsive to external engagement. You know, that's what I said in the second point, which is, you know, consultation, responsive to the needs and requirements of stakeholders. You know, what are the requirements? What are those things that industry, for instance, or the citizens of a country that you govern over, what do they need? And then you must conduct a very thorough appraisal. So appraisal can vary from impact assessment to business case. Business case is not just for people that are trying to open a business. Business case is for making a case for a change, making a case for an alternative reason for passing a rule or a law, a legislation, or, you know, a market regulation. And then you must be very clear on the role of government and who is responsible for delivering, for executing that policy. And then you must establish an effective kind of monitoring and evaluation system to be able to test whether the policy that you've passed or the policy that you've executed has delivered on the objective that you had set, and whether the people of your country or your workers within a corporate setting are satisfied with the policy that you've passed. So, you know, so I've just taken you briefly through what you probably spent an hour to do last week. And what myself and Onyi are doing this afternoon or this evening is to essentially take you through, you know, how to conduct a thorough appraisal in order for you to be able to make an informed policy recommendation, either to your ministers, to the president, to your CEO. In my previous job, I was doing that to the prime minister. You know, I was actually influencing, contributing to the development of policy making. And currently I'm doing that to cabinet ministers as well, making sure that all of the policy on infrastructure funding and delivery are evidence-based. They're not just, you know, you sit in a room and talk together and rabble together and put something together and send it to the minister. No, it has to be appraised, evidence-based. Can we go to the next slide, please? Oyin, do you want to take them through the process?
Okay, thank you, Adewunmi. Just to also mention that for some people that might be new to the idea of policy making, and for those that didn't join the last class, I hope the explanation that Adewunmi just shared would make more sense to you. But as we go through, we'll be sharing more examples, so that would also help. But to mention, before I get into this slide, to also mention that the process of policy making, as it sounds, is a process. To make something takes a process, right? And essentially, when you're thinking about policy making, you have to look at the beginning and the end. And like he explained, there are several factors that you need to consider to make a good policy. So take, for instance, if you want to change a policy on maybe corruption in the civil service, for instance, you will first of all have to frame the problem. We need to understand what the problem is and what that policy would solve. And in framing that problem, you need a lot of appraisals, you need a lot of analysis, all of the things that Adewunmi had mentioned before now. If you want to frame a problem, for instance, in that regard, you cannot just say all civil servants are corrupt. That's a very broad statement. It's not founded. You don't have the evidence to say that. So if you're making a policy around that kind of thing, for instance, it's more like it's dead on arrival because you've not framed the problem well and you've generalized the problem. But because of our time, we'll just go straight to the policy recommendations. So from a policy brief, the reason why you write a policy brief is to recommend a course of action, right? To recommend something to a particular set of stakeholders. It could be the government, it could be the state government, it could be the federal government, it could be another kind of stakeholder. And we decided to make it as easy as possible to understand. And since this is a 1-hour class, so to speak, we just try to use this approach so that everybody can get on board with it. The first thing to consider is the rationale. Like Adewunmi explained earlier, there has to be a reason behind the policy you are writing or the policy recommendation you are making. There has to be a rationale behind it. And that rationale cannot be emotional. That rationale cannot be an unfounded statement. It has to be based on evidence, right? And the evidence has to be very robust, not just picking data or information from somewhere and saying, oh, because of this, then this policy is recommended. No, you don't do that. It has to be robust evidence, and the evidence has to be open as well. Then another thing to consider is the objectives and the options. And as usual, our SMART approach comes to play here again, the specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and time-bound approach. You would want to write a policy objective that is SMART, because you are dealing with different stakeholders. Yes, you have a target audience, but you want your policy brief or your policy recommendation to be clearly understood. You won't want a situation where you're writing a policy brief or a policy recommendation, and then people are coming to ask you, I don't understand what you wrote. Can you make it clearer? So it has to be as clear as possible. And the SMART approach is a good way to ensure that that's done. Then for the cost and benefits, if you are proposing a recommendation, for instance, you would have to help us see the cost of that recommendation and the benefit of it. Adewunmi would explain better as we move ahead, but just to get a sense of why are we doing this? What would it cost us? There has to be value for money. If you're asking us to spend money in implementing something, for instance, we need to see that we're putting our money in something that will bring value to us, right? So that has to be clearly understood when you're developing the recommendation. Another thing to look out for is risks and assumptions. They are, like Adewunmi also mentioned earlier, there are alternatives to the recommendation you are proposing. Let's give a typical example. If you are, someone want to say something? Oh, okay. I'll just go ahead. If you are proposing a policy to say ban Okada riders in a particular community, for instance, you have to look at the alternatives that people have. People that use the Okada, for instance, people that use Okada riders, are people that commute using Okada. If you don't provide an alternative for them, automatically that policy recommendation is almost dead on arrival. Because if there's no alternative, how do you expect the policy to be implemented? How do you expect to ensure compliance? So those are the aspects that the risk and assumptions bit would cover, but we'll get to understand better as we move on. Then of course you have to understand the wider impact. You are not proposing a recommendation just for the now. It has to be something that has a broader impact. It has to be something that people can look back 5, 10 years and even more from now to say, oh, this policy recommendation was actually useful, was actually relevant to achieve outcome ABC or impact ABC, for instance. And of course, the good old monitoring and evaluation. Whatever you don't monitor, you can't account for. Whatever you don't evaluate, you cannot tell whether or not it's effective. So monitoring and evaluation would always be important in developing policy recommendations. Next slide, please. Okay.
Well, yeah. Thank you very much, Oyin.
Yeah.
So don't worry, I've removed the impact point on impact, so that's probably why it looks different. Because we'll speak to it in the rounds anyway. So what are policy recommendations? It's very simple. A policy recommendation is the advice that some set of actions should be taken. You are advising government at any level, or within corporate organization, your management at any level, that a specific action should be taken. And the goal of many policy professionals, including myself and some of us here, or in think tanks, or charity organizations, or multilateral banks, and so on, is to be able to publish a report and make policy recommendations to influence and shape, policy and or shape an outcome of a situation. So a classic example is the policy making or the government. I think the thinking of policy to ban Okada riders in the entire nation of Nigeria, or in Lagos, for instance. And whoever is coming up with that policy is essentially influencing the decision-making process of the government. So policy professionals, you have a very great deal of power when advising government, because you're essentially helping government to make decisions. So when you're making policy recommendations, always bear in mind the kind of power you wave, and the kind of power to influence and shape outcomes and impact people's lives. So in the last 2 years or 3 years, the government of Nigeria, or the government of Buhari, made the decision to close the borders, and that really impacted a lot of people. So a recommendation like that impacted so many people, and policy recommendations has far-reaching implications. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So like Oyin was talking about, so in coming to a policy recommendation, you need to go back to the fundamentals. You need to go back to the basics, which is what are your objectives? Why are you pursuing this policy? Is there an alternative to that policy? And in helping you to understand how to formulate the rationale for your policy, it's always advisable to write your policy objectives using the SMART approach, which is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. And for the sake of time, I wouldn't want to be going into each and every single item. Essentially, when you are making policy, you take the Okada riders banning, for instance, is a very specific policy. So, but is it measurable? Is it achievable? Is it relevant? Is it timely? Is this a good time to actually ban people from making ends meet, when a lot of people cannot find alternative jobs to feed themselves and their family? there is a high level of insecurity. So if you ban Okada riders, a lot of them will probably get into criminal activities. Is it achievable? The government only has about less than 18 months to go. Can they achieve it with this time frame? Is it a good legacy for them? Is it measurable? How do you measure, the transition of people from Okada riders to other kind of means of livelihoods? You need to be able to do that. But it's very specific in my view, because you know what you're trying to do. But the other, element of smart is very questionable given this example. So policy objectives should reflect the outcomes rather than outputs. And I think I've mentioned the word outcomes a couple of times now. So what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve, which is back to your objectives? Is there a specific outcome that you want to achieve, or there are a number of outcomes that you'd like to achieve? So is it that you want to improve the health of the people? Why is the government of Nigeria looking to ban Okada riders? Why did Buhari and his government close the borders between Nigeria and Niger? You really, really need to have a clarity of purpose, clarity of thoughts on what outcome you're trying to achieve. Is banning Okada riders going to reduce the number of crime rates in Lagos? Would it reduce the number of insecurity attacks in Nigeria? Would it help with economic growth, more jobs? Would it make more people employable or unemployed, etc., etc.? So you need to really think about the rationale, the reason you're doing this policy, or you're trying to pursue a specific policy. And you should consider how policy interlinks throughout, your nation, not just on unemployment, not just security, but you also need to think of investments. You also need to think of taxation. You also need to think of education. If you ban Okada riders, some Okada riders will not be able to pay the school fees of their children. And then you have an increase in the number of out-of-school children. So you need to work with Ministry of Education. And this kind of line of thinking and thought process is probably what we need to infuse into our national lives in Nigeria, or in Africa, if you like, in terms of how we make policy. Can we move to the next slide? Unless anyone has any question before we move on. Do we have any question in the chat? Terry?
No, there is none. Please let's
okay. So
let's move on. Thanks.
Yeah, so when you are assessing your policy, the reason why a specific policy should be pursued, you would normally have to consider doing a business case or an impact assessment. And an impact assessment, you would essentially need to identify all of the options that are available to you. So you would normally identify between 5 to 10 options, and then you begin to kind of shortlist which of the options to take forward. So you begin your elimination process, and that would be based on, doing cost-benefit analysis of each option, of each recommendation that you're putting forward. And even if you're running a business, before you pursue entering a market, you want to be able to identify what options are available to you as a business owner to enter the market, and you want to do elimination process. You start with a long list, then you go to a short list, and then you have a preferred option in delivering that policy. What that's the preferred option that you then need to focus on, and that you would then recommend to, whether your government or your CEO or chief executive and so on. And you do a business case, or you do an impact assessment. And I'm sure everyone on this call probably knows what an impact assessment is. An impact assessment is essentially an analytical tool that you can call it economic analytical tool that you put together to be able to understand the cost and benefit, or the net present value of the cost and benefit of the policy that you're putting forward. So you have to have your long list of policy, short list of policy, and the preferred policy, and you filter through. You just don't go straight to your preferred option. I don't know what alternative the government of Buhari or this current government have gone through to come to the conclusion that actually banning Okada riders is the preferred solution. I hope they've gone through a series of elimination, and they've conducted the cost and benefit of doing what they're about to do. Can we go to the next slide, please? So when you're conducting your impact assessment, like I mentioned earlier, so you need to do cost and benefit analysis. What is the impact? What's the cost impact of the policy, of the new policy, of the existing policy that you want to kind of change the legislation, for instance, and compare it to the benefits. You know, what's the baseline? What's the kind of pre-existing situation? What's the status quo? And you have your baseline, then you have your, you essentially do a scenario analysis. Baseline, option 1 of this policy is change it. Option 2, make it harder. Option 3, make it less harder. I don't know. You just have a series of, you know, kind of comparative analysis that you need to do in terms of coming to a decision and coming to an understanding of what the cost and benefit analysis is. And you need to monetize them, because if you're running a government, and we need to get into the idea of that every policy that is being made by the government, there is a cost monetary implication to that policy. Maybe not directly to you, and sometimes Nigerians don't feel it. That's why most of them don't complain sometimes. But you need to really understand how much money, how much of the taxpayers' money the government will be spending or losing as a result of that specific policy. And I think when we begin to think about government policy or policies in this manner, I think Nigerians will become, or we will become, much more vocal when governments are passing rules or policies or legislations. And that's the point I'm hoping we can get to with this policy hackathon that will be happening in August, to encourage and teach people about the implication of government policies on their lives, their children's lives, their future, and so on. When the cost of a policy is too high, you will find that a lot of things will be going wrong in the society. So generally, when you're talking about, you know, the impact of policies, it's not just people in Nigeria that is going to affect. It's going to affect people that are Nigerian but outside of Nigeria. So, for instance, take the policy on Nigerian government for passports. I don't know how easy is it for you guys to get passports in Nigeria, but I can tell you the policy of just getting people to have passport for 5 years, I think is a ridiculous idea, is a ridiculous policy, because every 5 years you try to go and get new passports here in London, and you spend so much money and time. Sometimes you even have to take a day off work to get a new passport. So that's the impact of Nigerian government policy in Nigeria on Nigerians outside Nigeria. And you have to also think of the impact on foreign investors if they want to come into Nigeria. And when you begin to kind of accumulate the cost of these things, you begin to understand that policy, domestic policies or foreign policies, are far reaching beyond Nigeria. So when you begin to monetize it and you begin to kind of translate it into direct benefits, direct, indirect benefits, and then you begin to think of the wider impact. Can we go to the next slide, please? Oyin, do you want to speak to this one?
All right, thank you, Babayemi Oyinkansola. I don't know why I keep calling your surname. Okay, so the theory of change approach is one of the ways through which you carry out the impact assessment, and essentially it also shows you or gives a clearer picture of the costs and benefits, like he was explaining earlier, of that policy recommendation or those policy recommendations you are proposing. And the idea behind the theory of change is to sort of give a graphical view of what you are proposing and then the impact it will have. What needs to be done to achieve the impact that you are claiming that policy recommendation will make. So let me give a typical example. With the work that I do at the NESG, I work with subnational governments. Essentially, that means state governments, right? And what we try to do is to help states to improve on their competitiveness so that we don't have a situation where states are only dependent on the FAC allocations that they go to collect on a monthly basis at the federal government level. And the idea or the overall essence or objective of this initiative is to ensure that states are self-sufficient, right? It may not be something that can happen maybe in the next 1 or 2 years, but over time, if they continue to do certain things, the expectation is that they are self-sufficient. So our basic theory of change is this: if you help the states to in quotes, repackage themselves, if you help to improve their subnational competitiveness indicators, for instance, what makes them attractive to investors, for instance, there was something that Adewunmi said about visas. Foreign investors want to come into Nigeria and then they have a hard time getting their visas. It becomes a problem. It means that Nigeria is not as attractive as it's supposed to be to generate the kind of foreign investment that we want. So I remember that PBEC did one reform around visa on approval, and that helped a lot of foreign investors such that when they come into the country, they can get their visas approved. I don't recall the duration of time, but it was a major reform and it helped to attract FDI into the country. So the idea behind the theory of change is, let's be clear on what needs to be imputed, what needs to be done, what activities need to come into the inputs, right? And what kind of output to be generated and what the long-term impact is. So let's go back to our Okada example, for instance. If you say you are recommending a policy to ban Okada riders, the theory of change approach will show us what exactly needs to be done. In banning the Okada riders, are you going to say, at the level of selling, that's production, at the level of selling, we're going to stop those who are selling Okadas? Is that the approach you want to take? Are you going to say, at the Okada parks or the Okada associations, you're going to seize all the Okadas from the Okada riders? There have to be clear inputs and then activities, and then what happens as a result of those activities, and then the wider outcome. So this is just one of the ways of ensuring that your policy recommendation is clear enough. Essentially, people want to see the big picture. If you are making a recommendation to government, for instance, there's this notion that a lot of young people like to speak plenty English, or a lot of think tanks or institutes like to speak a lot of English. They're asking you what exactly would happen. What is the benefit of this policy recommendation? How would it impact the bigger population, for instance? So what this theory of change approach does is it makes it very clear. We need to do this. If you bring this input and you add this activity, this is the expected output. And from this output, this is the expected outcome. So that's essentially what this does. And it makes it clearer so people can see and say, this is what you are trying to achieve. This is the bigger picture. Another example to use is the reform IELTS policy, policy recommendation that the Facilitators team was working on, or is currently working on. There's a clear theory of change. We're saying add Nigeria to the list of majority English-speaking countries. And then the policy shapers team went ahead to tell us how much money is currently being spent on these exams and how much money can be saved. And then what happens when Nigeria is added to that list. So it's very, very clear. The policymakers are not confused as to what the outcome is. They are not confused as to what the output is. So essentially, that's what the theory of change approach does. It makes it clearer, and then they can see the bigger picture.
That's a very relevant and good example, up-to-date example. So in making policy recommendations, you also need to think about the risk and the probability of, the impact, whether negative or positive, of that particular intervention. So we've spoken very much about the ban of Okada riders. We've spoken about the previous closure of borders between Nigeria and Niger, or was it Togo? You should try and quantify the cost and risk of these policy recommendations or policy ideas, because I'm very sure somebody in his or her infinite wisdom somewhere in government thought it was a very good idea to close Nigeria border to Togo, or to ban Okada riders, someone, and they're advising the government of Nigeria to do so. And not just in Nigeria, any government, I work in central government of the UK in the Prime Minister's office as we speak, and, they come up with different policy ideas. They're politicians. They do not really understand in details. It's down to policy officials to be able to tell the politicians that, look, hang on a minute, before you come up with this policy idea or go out to the public to talk about your policy ideas, can we think about the risk, the externalities, the impact, the direct impact? What are the risks? Let us quantify this. and then be able to go to the public and tell them, look, this is what would happen if we go with this policy idea. So you should include all of the potential impact, that is likely to occur, direct or indirect, all of the externalities, negative, positive externalities. And there is not a question of bounded rationality when you are putting together a policy idea. I'm sure most people know what bounded rationality is, which is you're making a decision without having so much information. And to avoid that is why we say you have to go through the process of collating all of the information to be able to make an informed decision about policy recommendation. So the impact assessment should identify any gaps, especially for existing policies, existing laws. Are there any gaps that existing laws or policies isn't covering now? And then you kind of re-engineer the existing policy, try to identify the gaps, quantify it, and then integrate it, and then pass your policy recommendation. So they say it is best practice to include your low, central, and high scenarios. So I think earlier I mentioned about doing a scenario analysis in terms of your policy options, your recommended options, and saying, option one, the low, central, and high situation will be this as a result of that. And then you use that elimination process to eliminate a lot of the options before you get to your policy preferred approach. Can we go to the next slide, please? I'm just conscious of time, so I'm just going to try and rush through the last two slides. So in terms of wider impact, there's a lot of things about climate change, environmental impact, justice, equality, and so on. So you have to identify all of these and you have to quantify them. And another thing, you also have to quantify the impact on national treasure. So for instance, maybe Aso Rock is a national treasure. So what would be the impact of kind of giving planning permissions to developers to build on a site very close to the Zuma Rock, for instance? So that's a national treasure. I don't know, there are many national treasures in our country. So you need to also include that. You need to include the impact on the climate, given that a lot of countries have now signed up to climate mitigations and adaptation. And there's a climate COP27 happening right here in Africa, in November in Egypt. They'll be talking more about climate mitigation and adaptation. And I think is becoming an increasingly important topic. When you are putting together policies, you need to actually quantify the impact of these things, impact on public sector, private sector, consumers, and so on. And I think I've spoken about environment and wider societal impact. How is it going to impact people at the lowest ladder of the society? The disabled, the educated, the uneducated, to the handicaps and so on. So you need to consider all those things. Can we go to the next slide, please? Monitoring and evaluation. I think this is as important as actually formulating your policy, because if you don't have this process in place before you even start making a policy recommendation, you will find that everything that you've done is just going to waste, because you need to be able to develop and build on previous policy implementation, policy experience. And I think this is one of the major reasons why we as a country and as a nation, we've not been able to learn properly in terms of development, in terms of policies. The current economic climate that we have in Nigeria today is not the very first time we are having it. We had it during the first time that Buhari was in government, exactly the same scenario. So I don't think anyone has actually gone, or even Buhari himself had asked his economic advisor to say, I'm going to meet Bismarck. I think his economic advisor is Bismarck, or one Mr. I can't remember, a Yoruba man. That what actually happened in 1983. Can you go back and look at it and let me know what some of the policies that we've made and what did we do wrong? What have we done right? How can we make it right this time? And that's the whole purpose of monitoring and evaluation. In the context of the past and in the context of the future, you need to be able to monitor the impact of existing policies and evaluate how you can make it better. And you have to have a number of KPIs to which you're measuring it by. And Milton Friedman, as you guys would know, is one of the leading global economists. One of the quotes that he gave was, one of the greatest mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results. And I think a lot of us do get carried away in that part of the world where, oh yeah, this person is trying to do this, this government is trying to do this, but what is the result? What's the end goal? How is it going to benefit the larger population? We can go into the policy relating to Dangote, for instance, is building, was it building in Lagos? I've actually been there in 2016 when they first started it. And I was telling a group of my friends, I said to them, I told them, I feel this is nonsensical, waste of money and waste of space. But you know, we will see the impact of that in the next 10 years. That's a debate on its own. And a lot of policies like that, you see, the intention is good, but the result is not necessarily a good thing for the majority of people. And that's on that basis that you always have to make recommendation, the majority, the benefit to the majority, which is what Milton Friedman is trying to pass across here. I think that is the last slide. Or is there one more? Okay, I think this is the last slide now. Yeah. So when you're conducting monitoring and evaluation, you should make sure you consider a number of things. And you know, what we've got on the list there is what you should be considering. Who's going to monitor what? Who's going to assess the objectives that have been met? You know, you have to get somebody independent to verify that you've achieved the objectives of the policy, and you cannot mark your own homework. Somebody independent has to do that. What data is needed, they will determine that you need to kind of come together and agree the terms of reference before the policy is passed. Why you would need to collect extra data if needed. What is this timescale? What's the budget to do it? And what circumstances might change that timescale? So for instance, the INEC in 2019, they held an election. Hopefully somebody somewhere have been invited to conduct an evaluation of their last performance, and hopefully they'll be able to reflect the changes in 2023. I think that is the end of the presentation, and I think myself and Oyin would welcome any questions, suggestions, input, objections, you know. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adewunmi, and thank you, Oyin. That was very good. That was very enlightening, even for myself that have worked, you know, in the policy space as well. Some of the very key things, my key takeaway, and I'll just share with everyone while we're preparing our questions and our contributions as well, not just questions, but if anything have popped out to you, you know, in the course of the presentation, please feel free to share. For me, I think the cost, thinking about the costs of policy outcomes, I mean, that's one of the things that you find, you know, many policy framework don't really interrogate what it will cost to implement policies, or what to cost if those policies are not properly implemented, you know, and that was a comment that Adewunmi made about monetizing the effect, you know, of local policies and the extent that, you know, it can impact you know, the general public life, both locally and externally. That was very good. Thank you so much. I also want to thank you, Wayne. You know that thing you said about what the theory of change really does for us. You know, you said something about it shows us what needs to be done and the how. I thought that was really remarkable. Thank you guys very much. I'll pass it over to our participants. Are there questions? Please feel free to ask your questions. Or do you want to share with us some of the outstanding comments from today's session? We have just a few minutes, so we'll give about 2-3 minutes for that. Thank you. Any takers? Okay, I hear someone unmuting. Or any of the policy shapers have something to chip in?
Good evening.
Hi, good evening.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Dayo Kasim. Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. This has been on my mind for a while, though. I would like to know if it's possible to actually satisfy the majority when shaping your policy or recommending one. Is it actually possible to satisfy the majority? Why am I asking these questions? You know, all along we've made reference to the banning. We've made reference to the banning of Okadas and all of that. Yes, we're doubting the thoroughness of that policy, but is it actually possible to get the concurrence of these Okada associations for the ban? Will these people agree? So the question in summary is it possible to make a policy where the affected people will agree? And that's also like a majority too. Is it possible?
Thank you. So before you take the question, let's see if we have one or two more so we can take all the questions together because of time, yeah? All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So do we have any more questions? Anybody? Okay, all right. So, you know, we have the 7 seconds thing. If you ask a question and within 7 seconds you've not gotten an answer, you can move ahead. That was the research work. So let's go ahead with the response. Thank you.
Oyin, do you want to go first?
Okay, I think first things first is every policy, like we said earlier, has a target audience, right? There's a target audience, there's a target population, there's a specific issue that needs to be addressed. Now, in terms of whether or not the people who will be affected will agree with it is another conversation entirely. I think this is where we now need to look at what is for the greater good. For instance, when I was in Kaduna State government, that's Malam's, that's the governor's, would I say mantra now? His focus is what is for the greater good. You would never have a policy recommendation that would favor everybody 100%, but you have to, based on evidence, see what best works for the greater number of people and then implement regardless, bearing in mind that you have also factored in the impact assessment, you've looked at the counterfactuals, you've looked at the counter arguments, you've looked at the alternatives, and based on evidence, not emotions, based on evidence, you can see that this policy recommendation will favor a greater number of good without sentiments and emotions, then you can go ahead. Because if you keep thinking, oh, would they agree or would they not agree? Those things are not, they are sentimental essentially. They are not evidence-based. So you have to work with the evidence, and based on your evidence and other aspects of the policy design, because it has to be a very robust policy design. You have to frame the problem well, you have to look at the risks, you know, and all of that. So based on the evidence, then you go with what works for the greater number of people. And of course, it has to be timely too. Sometimes the recommendation you are bringing may not be timely. It might be the right thing to do, but it may not be timely. So that's another thing you need to consider, the timeliness, the political feasibility of that policy recommendation, and a couple of other factors. But let me stop there and allow Adewunmi speak to it.
Well, I think you've pretty much answered that question. But you know, you've got 200 million Nigerians, or so they say, 200 million Nigerians. And if you are passing a policy to just because you want to satisfy every single Nigerian, then you never move forward as a nation. And this is why I would always stress the importance of being very transparent. The government needs to be transparent in the process of policy making, inviting the association of Okada riders, for instance. Let them be part of that decision making. Have you consulted with them? Have they made their opinions and their kind of worries known to you? Have you monetized that as a government? And make the impact assessment public for every single person to be able to see. So in the UK, for instance, every single government legislation, if you go to Parliament website, you'll be able to find an impact assessment. And like Oyin said, you just make that policy for the greater good on the basis of the evidence that you've gathered, and you always want to make a policy where the net present value is positive, is greater than the benefit net present value of that policy is greater than the net present value of the negative. So that is the basis on which you make a policy that would be for the greater good of people. If you want to satisfy everybody, you would never move forward. I would have very much loved to cite an example, which is the fuel subsidy, but I think that's another kind of discussion on its own, and I will stop there.
I agree with you totally. Thank you guys so very much. Thank you. And so I'll just chip in very quickly and round off the session. Really, one of the missing ingredients in the policy space in Nigeria is evidence. Sometimes these policies come out and there is no place where you can track, what the objectives are, what the expected outcomes are. There is no analytics on some of those policies, and that causes a lot of problems, for Nigerians. You just end up hearing that this policy is going out, or this bill is being proposed without background information, and you can't get that in the public space. So that's one of the things really the policy shapers is also trying to address: open data source for policy recommendation, policy ideas as well, so that Nigerians can have a place, some sort of a library of information where they can interrogate policies that are being proposed. So, so thank you very much. Thank you, Adewunmi, and thank you, Oyin, for such a brilliant presentation. And thank you everyone who, took out your time to be part of this. We look forward to having you here next Saturday, where we continue the conversations, so that we can enrich the policy hackathon and going forward also enrich the policy space here in Nigeria. Thank you guys so much. Thank you.
Thanks
for the opportunity. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Well done.
Bye.
Good job. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much.